Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington, D.C. Today, we will talk about CPTPP, which is one of these trade-related acronyms. It stands for Comprehensive and Progressive Transpacific Partnership. And to help us understand what this is, we have two fantastic guests. We have the Honourable Greg Hands, who is Minister without Portfolio at the Cabinet Minister at the UK and a former Minister of State for Trade Policy. We also have my colleague Jeff Schott, who is a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute and who has written a lot about many things, but especially about CPTPP. And you are both very welcome here. So the Transpacific Partnership Agreement was an idea by President Obama to tighten trade relations between 12 Pacific Rim countries: Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and the US. It was supposed to facilitate trade, obviously, between partners, but also a kind of geopolitical tool to reduce dependencies on China and bring the countries together, closer to each other and closer to the US. So negotiations were quite hard and long, and they were concluded in 2016, but they were never ratified. President Trump, when he entered into office, he withdrew from the agreement as one of his first decisions when he was a newly elected president. But the remaining 11 countries, they made some smaller changes and amendments to the agreement and announced the creation of CPTPP. They added comprehensive and progressive to this. And these 11 countries, they stand for more than 13% of global GDP. So it's not negligible. The agreement incorporates a lot that was in the original TPP, both tariffs, non-tariffs, obstacles. There are common regulations on environment, on food safety, on investment, financial services, digital, and there is the creation of a special council on labor rights. So more or less what you have in a classical trade agreement. It took away a few things in the intellectual property chapter, shortening the patents and copyright terms, and abolished standards for digital IP protections. But it was rather very much like the original one. And it entered into force the 30th of December in 2021. And all countries but Brunei have ratified. Since then, it is up and running, and many countries have also applied to join. Ironically, China has applied, and Taiwan, the UK, and also Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Ecuador. And there are potential candidates, discussions about possibly applying to join in South Korea, Thailand, Philippines. And negotiations with the UK are basically done. And I wanted to ask you, Greg, you've been involved in this for a long time. Where is the UK in this process with CPTPP? What would be the main benefits of you entering, and what can you bring to the agreement?
Well, thank you, Cecilia. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Thank you to the Peterson Institute. And just as a bit of background, I've been heavily involved in the UK's negotiation, really right from the beginning. I've been most of the last 6 years at the Department for International Trade, and was there right at the beginning when we looked at this late in 2016, early 2017, I think, about 6 months after the famous UK referendum on leaving the EU. And inevitably, sometimes UK membership of CPTPP is looked at with reference to that. And I think that, I mean, it is relevant, but we shouldn't it isn't just about Brexit. But I think for the UK, I think what we bring to the agreement, that's probably an easier one to answer. The UK brings a very significant market. You mentioned, Cecilia, that CPTPP is currently about 13% of global GDP. That rises to 17% with the UK joining. I think also for CPTPP members, it sort of fundamentally changes the nature of the agreement from being a Pacific Rim agreement to becoming a more global agreement that will help set trading rules going forward. I would like to think of it as an alliance of the world's free trading nations. The most conspicuous absentees, if you like, are the United States, the European Union, and China. But I think the common characteristic of the 11 members, and also with the UK joining, that these are all countries very, very committed to global free trade. And I mean, those countries are quite different in their political systems. You know, you've got 3 or 4 Westminster-style democracies like the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, with a single-party communist country like Vietnam. So these are countries that don't necessarily have the same political systems, but I think are all committed in their own different ways to global free trade. So I think it also changes the nature of the agreement for the existing members and increases their, if you like, their critical mass, which you all know better than anybody, Cecilia. The ability to set global trade rules is often based on, what is your critical mass that lies behind you. So I think that's kind of what's in it for them. I think for us, it's an opportunity. Half of the world's middle classes will live in the Asia Pacific by the year 2030. CPTPP is obviously not synonymous with Asia Pacific, far from it. It doesn't, as you rightly point out, China's not in it, India's not in it, but you can see where that direction of travel is. I think for the UK, it also enables us to be, again, at the forefront of setting global free trade rules. In a way that we would be influential. I think it was just the UK, and we were, partly influential when we were members of the European Union. But I think here enables us to be, again, right at the forefront of setting those global free trade rules. I think also CPTPP, if I might, I think is quite well suited to the UK, to our economy. It's got very good data digital provisions. It's very liberal, or at least the most recent version that I saw, very liberal on rules of origin. And you'll know, Cecilia, the UK, when we did our own negotiation with the EU, which is a very good agreement, the UK-EU free trade agreement, zero tariff, zero quota, was not very liberal on rules of origin, which is something that we want from the UK side, that we wanted it to be. I don't want to go into sort of like into the past sort of Brexit negotiations, but I think CPTPP is good for the UK because we are a country of sort of global supply chains. So I think those liberal rules of origin, I think, good for the UK. It's good for Mode 4 business visas as well. I think is good provisions, good liberal provisions, which the UK likes. The ability for our business people to get more easily into even countries like Canada, Australia can be quite difficult for business people to enter into from the UK. So I think for a number of reasons, it's a good agreement for the UK. And also just to add finally, the political angle, I think is also important for us. The UK has made our own Indo-Pacific tilt, our own integrated review, sort of key changes in UK foreign policy. I should say developments in UK foreign policy rather than changes. I think joining CPTPP aligns well with what we call our Indo-Pacific tilt policy of greater engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. But I think for us, joining CPTPP, if you like, reflects also a greater desire to engage in the Asia Pacific region. So I think for all of these reasons, good old-fashioned free trade reasons, good old-fashioned national interest, and good old-fashioned sort of the UK as a global player. I think for all of these reasons, it's a good thing for the UK to be doing, and it's consumed. I mean, it's taken longer than I think anybody would have liked, to be frank. We can maybe talk about that. The next stage is, so we've got the agreement. I mean, it's the nearest thing would be roughly equivalent to agreement in principle. I think there'll be a signing coming up in the summer. Getting all the countries together is not always that easy. And then I think for it to enter into force, I think it's got to be ratified by more than half of the current members and obviously ratified by the UK as well. So I think 6 of the 11 have to ratify for it to enter into force for the UK joining. So that I think is if you like, a sit rep of where UK membership is. I think is a big achievement for us. I think it's great. It's one of these, as you know, most trade agreements really are win-wins. And I think this is a win for the UK and a win for the existing CPTPP 11.
Thank you very much. This is very exciting. And of course, as the first newcomer in this organization, you will set the tone a little bit as well. Jeff, this originally was an idea by the Obama administration, and for all the reasons that Greg outlined, classical free trade, but also to align with friendly countries in a dynamic region. Why did the US leave, and why hasn't the Biden administration rejoined? This is the perfect setting of friends and in the concept of friendshoring. Will the US ever join? What do you think?
Well, those are the classic questions. But let me first start by congratulating Minister Hans. I think the successful conclusion of the accession negotiations is, as he said, tremendously important for the UK and the CPTPP members, but also for the future of the world trading system, because it sets a tone and a direction, a projection to continue to augment and improve international trade rulemaking and to continue to open markets for more competition. So, and a very important signal being set by the UK negotiations with the CPTPP that is particularly important at this time. Now, for your question, Cecilia, it actually wasn't a US-started negotiation. Its roots lie in the Asia Pacific and the desire to deepen and secure US engagement in the region, both economically and strategically. President Obama, once he had cleared the not resolved, but stabilized the US economy following the great financial crisis that existed when he took office, turned immediately to the Asia Pacific. And one of his first steps was to join negotiations for a Transpacific Partnership that started in March of 2010. Once the US came in, the US took over. And basically the negotiations were about an agreement based on US law and US practice. And starting from the template of the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which was at that time the state of the art, and indeed has been followed by the European Union Korea Free Trade Agreement and the UK Korea Free Trade Agreement that basically follow the same path. So it's essentially what the US wanted in terms of updating the international trade rulebook, removing barriers to trade in goods and services and agriculture, and adding new provisions on labor and environment and digital economy. It's all in there. And yet so if you look at the economics of it, it's a no-brainer. The US should have joined the agreement. The US should go back to the agreement. There are a number of studies that show how much the US has to gain from participation in the CPTPP, as it did in the TPP. But politics trumps the economics, or have trumped the economics so far. And both parties were critical of the agreement in the 2016 presidential election. And indeed, that political friction led President Obama not to bring the agreement to Congress for ratification, even though he signed it in February of 2016. But once President Trump took office, within the first week, he ripped it up. That was perhaps one of the biggest strategic blunders of the Trump administration, and that's saying something. Now, why hasn't the current Biden administration reversed course? I think here the issue is because of primarily because of politics, but also the economics of how the gains from trade are distributed within the U.S. economy. And there is a narrative, particularly in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, that past trade agreements, including the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, including NAFTA, including the TPP, were biased to favor corporations and to disfavor workers. And so they want, the Biden administration wants a rebalancing. That's what Catherine Tai talks about all the time, a worker-centric trade policy. There's room to do both. And indeed, much of the rebalancing needs to occur through domestic legislation in the United States, both through regulations, through tax policy, and through social programs. And President Biden has made substantial gains in that direction through major legislation that was passed last year. But the politics is so evenly divided in the United States that it looks like trade agreements are not going to move forward politically. The administration doesn't want to bring anything to the Congress. The Trade Promotion Authority has lapsed. And so I fear that this is an issue that is going to be kicked down the road through the next presidential election, at least. It doesn't mean we aren't engaged in trade negotiations. We have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework talks, where ministerial is taking place today in Detroit, or this week in Detroit. APEC meeting in ministers are meeting in Detroit today. But those negotiations are unlikely to result in the U.S. changing its laws and practices and requiring going to Congress, the administration going to Congress to ask for authorization to make those changes. So that's where we stand. It's unfortunate, but I suspect that changing circumstances, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and in relations with China, could change the equation. And one of the bright signs is that the prospective membership of the United Kingdom in the CPTPP certainly enhances the attractiveness of the agreement and provides another avenue for the United States to move forward with the UK and achieve essentially the free trade agreement that both countries have been talking about for some time.
Well, that would be convenient. You said that the negotiations have been taking longer than you expected, Greg, but looking at it from a broad perspective, I think they were rather quick, actually, if you compare to many other negotiations. I mean, it hasn't been entering into force for a very long time, and still, you are about to enter maybe beginning of next year with all the ratification and the processes that are needed, of course. So it has been in entering into force up and running around 1.5 years or something like that. And also China and Taiwan have applied, and a variety of other countries as well, showing that it's an open agreement. Countries are encouraged to apply. So it's a bit ironic if China joins, or at least because one of the geopolitical discussions around this was that you should be stronger vis-a-vis China, and now China has applied to join. How do you see that? What's the debate in the UK? Because as a member, you will of course have your say, like everybody else, and we all know that this is a complicated situation. Obviously, is this something that has been discussed in the membership negotiations that you can reveal, or is this something that is being debated in the House back home?
Yeah. Thanks, Cecilia. Well, a couple of things. I'd say first of all, I think it has taken longer, to be honest, than we would have liked. As stating the obvious, if you like, joining. As you'll know, sort of doing an FTA, you sort of start a negotiation. nothing's been agreed at all, and you might take something, as Jeff sort of used, ably illustrated. You might take for chorus off the shelf, or take the UK Korea or the EU Korea or whatever, and base it on that. Here we're negotiating to join an existing text in the case of CPTPP. Now, on the face of it, that should be easier, but also it can be more difficult in that the existing members say, well, you want to join, you've got to sign up to our text, and we will say, well, can we adapt it? Can we find different ways? And but I think it shouldn't be as long given an existing text compared to sort of doing something from scratch. But nonetheless, we are pleased, and we got very, very good support throughout the process. One of the ironies is that probably the most supportive countries through the process were countries like Vietnam, and some of the more difficult countries during that process were some of our, shall we say, sort of more natural, longer standing friends and allies, without naming anybody. But you'll know, trade negotiations are often like that. Your friends are the most difficult people to negotiate with. But anyway, look, we're really, really pleased to be in. I think in terms of widening the agreement, important to say that there must be, if I understand correctly, unanimity amongst the current members. We are not a current member. Therefore, the UK does not have a say currently on who would join CPTPP. That was not part of our negotiation, so not around the table that anybody asked, what would be the UK's view on applicant country A, B, C, D, or E. But certainly, that is discussed between trade ministers, off the table, I would say, or away from the table. And the UK, notwithstanding the fact that we can't really have a position on others joining until we ourselves are members, the one thing I would say is that most CPTPP members have real doubts as to whether China would be able to meet the requirements of CPTPP for a start. You'll get differing views. You can probably guess which are the more China skeptic and which are the more China enthusiastic countries. And of course, some of those countries have themselves had government changes in the last year or two, which might have changed that position a little bit subtly in terms of their approach to China. Well, we see it as the UK. We are definitely in favor of expanding CPTPP, in a broad sense. So, we are excited by the prospect of further countries joining, further large free trade economies joining. So without sort of, I'm not giving a specific position on a specific country, but say if Korea were to join, Thailand's
the EU
joining the EU. Well, to be honest, that's a question you'd probably be better able than almost anybody to answer, Cecilia. But if you think the EU could meet or could sign up to the provisions and still make it compatible with all of the trade approaches that we know the EU does, then the UK, I think it would be, anyway, it's a very hypothetical question because we're not yet members and the EU hasn't yet applied. So I probably shouldn't go down that road in terms of what our approach would be in such a case. One thing I would say, by the way, just as an aside, the atmosphere between the UK and the EU has improved considerably since the Windsor Framework and finding a good solution on trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So, I don't think there's any sense that the UK would have some kind of a hostile position based on politics. Let's put it that way. I think the UK would be looking at its relationship with the EU very pragmatically and looking to improve that relationship. So sorry, where have I got to? So I guess broadly, we would see CPTPP expanding. It's not right for me to comment on individual applications, particularly as we're not yet members. I think one of the lessons, if I might, from the UK process was it was very thorough. And I think a large part of the reason for it being so thorough was the fact that existing members, I think, wanted to create a precedent for future parties joining and wanted to make sure that the process for the UK was visibly quite thorough, to then be able to say to other members, you've got to meet our requirements. You've got to look at the existing text. That's basically the fundamental. If you're joining something, you've got to base it on the existing text. You can't sort of pitch up and hope to rewrite whole chapters. Of course, you can get deferments, you can get different opt-out type provisions, which we have done, but fundamentally it is an existing treaty and existing text. So that is, so overall we're in favor of growing the agreement, but it wouldn't be right for me to comment on individual countries joining. Yeah.
No, of course. So Jeff, you can comment on that from a more independent position. Mm-hmm. What do you think? China has applied, and so has Taiwan, and there is now established, as the minister said, there is a sort of formula. If you want to join, this is what you need to sign up to, which is transparent and accessible, can follow. So will China join? How do you see that? And would US accept that China joins?
Well, it's not, the U.S. is not a member of the group, so it has no say on whether...
Formally,
whether China can join or not, or qualifies or not. If it was a member of the CPTPP, it would have an effective veto, as every single existing member has. So that's one of the reasons why it was so odd for the United States not to reconsider membership when the Biden administration took office, because it was a way of controlling the situation of future members before China applied. But once China applied, it put existing members in a very difficult position, not wanting to say no to China, but not wanting to say no to the United States. So that was, Trump made the biggest strategic blunder, but the Biden administration has reinforced that blunder by not moving quickly enough to reconsider its strategic posture vis-a-vis China in the Asia-Pacific region at that time. And now China has applied, as well as Taiwan and several other countries, as you mentioned before. One thing is very important, though. Unlike the UK situation, where an accession working group was established about 8 months, I think, after the application was received, and that formally started the accession negotiations. That has not happened with any of the other applicant countries. So China applied in September of 2021. So it's been a long time, and it doesn't look like the establishment of an accession working group and the start of negotiations is anywhere close. So China is not even up to the starting line. So that means that Minister Hans may still have a say in what happens with China and all the other applicants once the United Kingdom is a full member of the agreement, which hopefully will come soon. That's an important consideration. And as the minister said, the terms of the UK accession protocol is critically important, because that sets the standard that there will not be wavering from the basic high standards of the CPTPP agreement. There's room for exceptions or transition periods, as the minister said. But essentially, it shows that overall, you have to meet the high terms. It would necessarily take China some time to get there, even if there's a willingness of all countries to accept them. But there is also room for some flexibility with regard to agriculture, so what I would call CPTPP plus standards with regard to health and food safety. That's been a concern for South Korea, and I think the South Koreans would be well advised to look closely at the terms of the UK agreement in the CPTPP and see how that assuages many of the concerns that they've had about finally submitting their application.
That's very interesting. As I said, it hasn't been into force for a very long time, but is it yet possible to draw some conclusion of the importance of this agreement? I mean, this is one of the biggest trade agreements in the world, with almost 14% of GDP, and adding when the UK joins as well. Has it had an impact? Are there any ways to tell or evaluate? Any of you know?
Well, I'll start very quickly and say it's had two impacts. First, even though the Democrats and the Republicans hate the TPP, they love the TPP when it's part of the new improved US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And indeed, much of the change between NAFTA and the USMCA are provisions that have been adopted from the TPP and the CPTPP. So it has shown the world that it is essentially state of the art in many areas, even though there are some issues with regard to digital economy and the like that can be improved and are being discussed in the WTO and in the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. So that's important. And following that, the CPTPP really is the standard bearer for moving forward with trade reform, improving the trade rule book so that it better meets the challenges of doing business in the 21st century.
Have you seen any evaluations, Greg, when you were negotiating this or discussing it?
Yeah, we did. In fact, it was very controversial. It was very controversial, Cecilia. We did, our own government department did a GDP analysis. We've had, to be frank, we've had difficulty for a long time now, well, ever since we've had the independent trade policy, in doing a proper evaluation. I'm getting into areas way beyond my technical competence here, but when it comes to gravity modeling and this kind of stuff, basically showed the UK joining CPTPP would have a very, very, very limited impact on GDP, about plus 0.08% to UK GDP. Now, obviously, we thought that was nonsense, in that the impact would be much larger. And you'll know from sort of the history of these analyses always tend to undershoot what the actual deliverables are. I think the most famous case was the New Zealand-China agreement that delivered like 50 times as much GDP gain as what was projected. I'm not saying there'll be 50 times the UK joining CPTPP, but clearly it's not going to be 0.08% of GDP. But it was quite controversial, and people saying, why are you joining this a set of countries on the Pacific Rim to get 0.08% of GDP? And so that was, and we'll have to see. My personal view is that because of the way I think the agreement is quite well suited for the UK and for the UK economy. There are areas that it mentioned data and digital. We've already done a digital economy agreement with Singapore, which I think goes further than CPTPP. You'll know as well as anybody that trade agreements, every trade agreement starts off being very, very modern, and then and this is already an 8 to 10 year old text or so in many ways. So we've already gone further, say, with the Singapore DEA. So there are definitely ways that one could go further in the future. But again, we're not yet full members ourselves, so it'd be a bit churlish of me to start proposing ways in which the agreement could go further. I think the one point that Jeff made, which is really interesting, on the accession working group, which for us was really important, managing and owning that process, and which of the countries kind of manages that process. For us, Japan chaired the accession working group, and that was really good for us because Japan were very, very keen on the UK joining, and that helped drive things forward. And it was actually the Japanese chairs who often were sort of knocking heads together on some of the countries that were sort of holding out, haggling for a little bit more here and a little bit more there. Japan did a really good job in trying to get people to focus. So I think that really does make a big impact. Who chairs that accession working group? Who does all the work around it? So that'll be an interesting one to watch out for as to if/when accession working groups do get appointed for some of these other applicants. Who is actually the country chairing that accession working group might kind of give a little bit of an early indication, I think, as to that likely direction of travel. But that's a really important part of it as well.
That's important. As you say, I mean, there's these calculations on the GDP, how much and how little, which is very hard to measure. But then there is also, I mean, the future work on standards and harmonization and developing joint practices. That is, of course, very beneficial as well, but it's hard to measure in the impact assessments. But the digital economic partnership that you have signed with Singapore, I mean, there is one with Singapore, Canada, Chile, New Zealand, and I think Canada is about to join. Could that be incorporated in the CPTPP as well?
Well, I think it's that sort of thing. I don't know about that specific text, but I think that sort of thing. You know, I don't know where. I don't want to speak for CPTPP, but I think, you know, inevitably you'll be thinking about where does it go, not just, you know, widening the agreement geographically, but how can you deepen it, make it more extensive, bring it up to date, modernize it, and those sort of discussions I think will inevitably happen. As you know, how do you and I don't think the countries that are involved, my impression is that an interesting contrast in the UK and the EU, Cecilia, which you know well on trade policy, one of the differences between ours is the UK is much more liberal when it comes to data localization rules, and that was something that we found aligned us quite nicely with CPTPP, although it does keep data localization rules, if I recall correctly, on financial services, which is an exception within it, I think. But that, again, suits the UK quite well, suits Japan very well, some of the other partners on data localization. These have often been countries that have been very resistant to having data localization rules. So that's also helped ours and might be an obstacle, though, if the EU were to think about going down that road. But that, again, is something for the future. But I think on data, digital trade, you know, I think my guess would be these are all places that would be a good area for fruitful discussion in the future for CPTPP members.
Jeff, you mentioned that the CPTPP is also a forum where you've seen reform and developing of trade rules. And we know that even if we have the WTO, and they are making some progress in reforming and developing, but of course the reform process there is very slow and difficult, and the US is not really engaging, and other countries also not. Is there a risk or a chance that CPTPP becomes sort of the new WTO, where rules are being developed and where the action is, as compared as the stagnating forces in WTO, where everybody knows what needs to be done, but it's really hard to move forward?
Well, I think the comments that Minister Hans made are appropriate here. So far, the CPTPP has not done any new negotiations or updating of the rule book since 2018. But many of the CPTPP countries are in the forefront of plurilateral initiatives and WTO initiatives that are designed to try to meet the new challenges, particularly in the digital economy sectors. So that's something that I think can evolve over time. We've been talking about expanding the membership of the CPTPP. I think over time the CPTPP has to be a living agreement and expand and update its rule book as well to remain relevant. All agreements basically have that challenge, and all negotiators have to have a bit of modesty in saying, well, we did as much as we could do given the economic and political circumstances at the time, but we have to keep vigilant and address the new challenges coming forward. I helped write the subsidy rules in the GATT back in the Tokyo round, back in the Middle Ages, and but I'm the first to say that was not the last word on subsidy disciplines, and indeed there are even now. 45 years later, there are big gaps in the subsidy rulebook that need to be filled. And one of the areas is regard to support to state-owned enterprises. And this is something that has a nascent coverage in the CPTPP, but might be of great significance as CPTPP countries going forward start thinking about expanding membership and how it would be applied to other countries like China.
But could this have a sort of positive, contagious effect on the WTO to sort of rejuvenate it a little bit? Because even if the EU, the US, and China are not in for the moment, these are important economies. They are all friends of the multilateral system and eager to stick to international existing rules and quite like-minded, at least most of them. Could this have a sort of spillover effect, or is it rather risking a further erosion of the WTO rule, and that this will be the new kid on the block?
Yeah, I wish I could say this will spur new WTO initiatives. That originally was the concept of bilateral and regional integration arrangements, that it would be negotiating laboratories for broader multilateral reforms. But what we found is that there are a number of spoilers. There's no way around it to say that India, South Africa, now Russia, less so China, are basically major obstacles to new agreements in the WTO, including some block of developing countries. That makes it very difficult. What we've seen in the Asia Pacific context, though, is a migration of many countries moving from lower or more shallow integration arrangements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that China is in, to upgraded agreements like the CPTPP. And many of or a good share of the RCEP countries are in the CPTPP, and several others are applying or thinking about applying. So we're seeing this migration up to upgrade trade obligations for very sound economic reasons, because this helps attract investment in their economies.
There's actually a question on this. CPTPP and RCEP, foes or friends in rule setting? A question from the audience. What's your view here?
Well, I think I just answered that.
You did in a way. Yes,
that they are complementary, and indeed the projection is for more and more RCEP countries to undertake or seek to undertake the obligations of the CPTPP.
Well, we see a very complex mix of countries being members of different trade organizations or corporations and so on. There's a question as well on Uruguay. I mean, it has applied to join the CPTPP, and it is member of the Mercosur, and this is a customs union. But I think if you look at the current membership, that is perfectly compatible. The Gabriel Papa asks, is belonging to a customs union consistent with joining the CPTPP? How could this dual membership be managed? In principle, this would not be a problem, would it?
I think legally it's a problem because there is a common customs area in the Mercosur. But there's broader problems in the Mercosur that are being addressed in the context of the EU-Mercosur negotiations. If you go back to the origins of the Mercosur, you will recall that, and I was involved in these talks, there was a debate, particularly between Brazil and Argentina, about whether to have a free trade agreement among the countries, which would enable the type of initiative that Uruguay is seeking, or a customs union. And for political reasons, they chose a customs union, even though merging the policies of the four countries was very difficult and remains difficult.
Yeah, originally Venezuela was part of it as well, but it was thrown out. Complications there as well. There is a question of the public opinion in the UK, and I think that is addressed to the Minister, to you, Greg. Despite the anti-trade political movements and the the person here says, I'm intrigued by the UK's accession to the CPTPP, given the Brexit era anti-trade sentiments. How was this overcome?
That's a good question.
And and is there a pitch to American policymakers and anti-trade interest groups on the CPTPP? So how did you have any sort of public opinion issues to address when you were negotiating this?
No, not really. Surprisingly little public hostility or opposition. Very little. In fact, as it happens, there was more opposition to us doing a bilateral FTA with Australia and to a small extent New Zealand than there was on CPTPP. The Australia issue, and people will be familiar from the TTIP politics around TTIP around 2014, 2015. There's a little bit of
I remember that, yes.
Yeah, I know. I thought you might. There was a little bit of a sort of an echo of that in that people published online pictures of Australian farms, these huge kind of stockade style farms, and questions about animal welfare standards and food standards in Australia, etc. None of which I think, in my view, was really valid. But nonetheless, there was quite a bit of public controversy around the Australia FTA. Very, very little interest in CPTPP, possibly because it seemed less kind of immediate. I think a lot of people want, we're doing this webinar about CPTPP, and I don't know if I popped out here into the streets of London, say, what is CPTPP? I might get a 5% response rate, 10% response rate. Whereas I said, where is Australia? I'll get 95%. I don't know, but there's very, very little opposition. There was a premise in the question though, which I just wanted to reflect on for a moment, because again, this webinar shouldn't be about Brexit, but I think it'd be a bit of a misnomer to say that Brexit was an anti-trade movement. I think there are different parts of the debate around Brexit, and trade wasn't. There was definitely a migration element of it, and the EU's free movement of labour policy was a big part of that Brexit debate back in 2016. Trade, as far as trade came up, was more used by the pro-Brexit element to actually, and all of these things, you've got to remember the whole kind of Remain side in the referendum and the Leave side were both kind of coalitions. So the Remain side, you had, David Cameron, the Labour Party, the Scottish National Party, the Lib Dems, quite a big, broad coalition. And the Leave coalition was sort of a collection of free marketeers plus a collection of populists, I think might be a better term. And the free marketeer element of the Leave part of the coalition were very critical of EU trade policy. And said the UK would be able to do a much better free trade policy outside of the EU, these kind of things. But trade, despite that, trade I don't think was a big part of the debate in 2016. Migration was, the financing of the EU was, sovereignty to some extent was. Trade, I don't think, was really much part of that debate. So. As much as it was, the people for whom trade was important for leaving the EU, I think were people who would welcome the UK joining CPTPP rather than the opposite. I think so I don't think there really was an anti-trade part of that. So I don't think that has turned out to be particularly an issue.
Okay, thank you. And here are a few questions to you, Jeff, of course, hypothetically, because you said, and I think that's the general feeling, that the US is not about to join CPTPP tomorrow. But if the US reactivates this discussion, would it then insist on enhanced IP suspended provisions? And would US membership of TPP bring the US back to a leadership in the WTO reform process?
Well, one of the ironies,
hypothetical, but you've been looking at this for so many years. So
one of the ironies is that after the U.S. withdrew, the CPTPP countries basically suspended or dropped out some of the intellectual property provisions that the Democrats had had contested and didn't like, and were part of the reason why President Obama didn't bring the agreement forward to Congress, because he didn't have enough support in his own caucus. So the CPTPP is not exactly the agreement that the U.S. signed. There are some provisions that are left out, but there's a broader issue with regard to intellectual property and digital economy and the like. And there is a political divide, even within the Democratic caucus, but certainly with Democrats and Republicans, on digital economy, privacy issues, and competition, particularly among the big companies in the sector. And that has made it very difficult, interestingly enough, for the U.S. to advance stronger digital economy provisions in the Indo-Pacific economic framework. We'll hear more about that in the next couple of days. But there is some friction within the Democratic caucus that is constraining what Katherine Tai would like to do in this area.
Yeah, but that's because of the IPEF countries are more or less the same countries as in the CPTPP. And of course, even if the framework of cooperation is slightly different, there is a trade element and there is a standard element as well, but there's no market access, and there is no, from the US side, there's no willingness of embark into that direction. So of course, that can also influence the willingness from the partner countries to do agreements with the US.
Yeah. Well, I know Greg wants to come in on this, but let me just say one thing. Basically, U.S. policy is undecided and is under debate. Which direction we're going to go with regard to competition, with regard to privacy. And while that is up in the air, it's very hard for trade negotiators to try to write concrete rules that would decide one way or the other.
Greg, did you want to comment this?
I just wanted to come in slightly tangentially to Jeff, but a point I was going to make earlier about the US actually, and returning, Jeff rightly raised the prospect of where is the US-UK free trade agreement now standing? And one of the things I've been interested in seeing is that we did the Windsor. We were told explicitly, but more implicitly, that one of the obstacles to doing a UK-US trade deal under the current administration was Northern Ireland and President Biden's interest in Northern Ireland and interest in finding a solution. Now we have done the Windsor Framework deal with the EU, which now, Cecilia, must be about now 10 weeks, 3 months or so ago. I'm not really fully up to date with where the talk, what the atmosphere is between the US and the UK on this, but it'd be interesting to see whether the administration does now wish to move forward trade talks with the UK, because that has the Windsor Framework and the Northern Ireland issue has removed prima facie one of the obstacles to going further. So I think that could be a key test as to how much the administration wants to do new free trade agreements, because that was always used as one of the reasons, or at least under the President Biden, not to do the deal was Northern Ireland, and that has now been removed.
No. There was also a question to you that you said that there are different ways of calculating the GDP benefits, immediate benefits of UK joining, and we could debate that or not. But are there any specific industrial sectors that you see are particularly advantaged by this, that you have identified in your process in the UK?
Yeah, I think things like automotive. I think it was big UK industry, and a big UK industry that depends on a global supply chain. For example, the classic large Japanese car makers present in the UK are now selling into markets like Canada, potentially Mexico. I think that is, if you like, an obvious one, but very directly benefiting both from the CPTPP geography, but also the rules of origin measures as well. I think a lot of our cutting edge fintech industries, particularly the ability they would have compared to, say, some of their rivals in the United States to sell into CPTPP, I think is another kind of key area for the UK. And also some, traditional British manufacturing industries. UK ceramics, we've got one of these areas where the UK is pretty good at ceramics. But selling ceramics into CPTPP would be another kind of classic case. So a mixture of, and plus services, industries dependent on Mode 4 and movement of professionals, I think would be another area I'd particularly highlight of those kind of things. And also, of course, CPTPP does bring in two countries with whom we have been trading entirely on WTO terms, like Malaysia. The UK has got quite good trade with Malaysia, historic links, huge number of Malaysians get educated in the UK. That's kind of really strong cultural links and current links. Just removing a whole lot of tariffs on trade with Malaysia alone will bring quite big benefits to the UK.
Indeed.
A classic example, you have to be slightly careful, but Malaysia, selling Scotch whiskey into Malaysia is an obvious example. I mean, that's purely, that is a big ticket item with big tariffs attached to it. That's, if you like, an obvious case where the benefit is obviously very, very immediate.
Maybe one last question to Jeff. I'm reminded here by a Mexican friend that in the USMCA agreement, there is a provision saying that Mexico and Canada cannot enter into a trade agreement with the non-market economy country. I don't know exactly how the formula is, but that means that technically the US can ask Mexico and Canada to block China's accession, right?
Yes and no. The provision is much weaker than the proponents claim. It is a notification requirement only, so that if Canada and Mexico engage in FTA negotiations with China or other countries, they have to notify the United States and engage in consultations if the US officials don't like it. But this is all academic. There are going to be consultations because the U.S. will insist on it, but there will also be strong Mexican concerns about Chinese participation. Whether or not the U.S. tells them to do it or not, the Mexicans have been protectionist against China for a long time. And I assume that they will continue to be highly skeptical of Chinese commitments to the CPTPP until they see that the actual standards have been fully met.
Great. So you've been very generous with sharing your views on this. Thank you so much, Greg Hans. Thank you so much, Jeff Schott. Thank you to you in the audience. There are lots of questions we could not take. Some of them has actually been answered during the talk. This is really much something, it's changing as we talk, and we'll see where all this leads. So maybe I'll ask you to come back and elaborate on what's happening in a couple of years, maybe new members and other directions. But thank you so much for joining, and thank you to you for listening.
Thank you.